Primeramente, déjenme decir muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos, welcome, bienvenue, bem-vindos, sobre todo os portugueses brasileiros que chegam afinal após o carnaval. Mi nombre es Luis Cahuachi, yo soy el coordinador académico del Congreso de las Américas para Educación Internacional. Es un gusto recibirlos en nombre de la OI. Gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy. Conforme nos preparamos para el CAEI Colombia 2019, la Secretaría Ejecutiva del Congreso organiza 4 seminarios virtuales o webinarios en colaboración con los miembros asociados del CAEI y el apoyo de nuestros socios nacionales e internacionales. Estas sesiones buscan ofrecer a los participantes una oportunidad de encuentro con reconocidos expertos internacionales para servir como punto de partida de las reflexiones y las conversaciones que serán parte integral de las diferentes actividades académicas previstas para el CAEI en Colombia en octubre próximo. For the sake of convenience, please allow me to switch to English. I remind everyone that CAEI is and will forever remain a multilingual conference, so please continue to address the Secretariat in the language of your choice, and that does include the rest of the session today. These webinars are being offered to you as conversation starters. In them, we will go over the conference's main conference theme and its 4 sub-themes, trying to present some examples and set the table in order to facilitate the exchanges and conversations among future CAEI participants. You should know that each webinar will run for about 60 minutes. The moderator will share some opening remarks and will introduce the session. Our main speaker will then share with you the body of today's discussion, which will be followed by a question and answer period. You are all invited to participate. Today's webinar is titled Knowledge Hubs and Their Communities, International Challenges and Opportunities. During this session, the speakers will go over some general principles surrounding the concept of knowledge hubs, how they impact our communities, and the ways in which higher education institutions can play a fundamental role at the local, national, and international level. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Laura Rumbley. Laura is the Associate Director for Knowledge Development and Research of the European Association for International Education, the EAIE. Until recently, Laura was Assistant Professor and Associate Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. She is the co-editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education. I'm glad to have a friend. Today's speaker is Professor Hans de Witt, a renowned scholar in the field of internationalization of higher education. His research focuses on national and institutional policies as well as international strategies in post-secondary education around the world. Before joining Boston College as professor and director of the Center for International Higher Education, he was director of the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan and taught at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. He served as founding member and president of the European Association for International Education and as founding editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education. It is for me a pleasure and a sincere honor to welcome Laura and Hans to today's seminar. It's up to you now.
Thank you very much, Luis, and I hope you can hear me.
Indeed.
In the spirit of multilingualism, I'll repeat your kind words of welcome, bienvenidos, bienvenue, and bem-vindos. Welcome to everybody who's gathered here today for this webinar offered by CAEI as a pre-conference activity for the conference to be held in Bogota in Colombia in October of this year. As Luis has indicated, my name is Laura Rumbley, and I'm joining you outside of the Americas today, situated in the Netherlands, where I serve as the Associate Director for Knowledge Development and Research at the European Association for International Education, or the EAIE. On behalf of the EAIE, I'd like to thank the Inter-American Organization for Higher Education for inviting us to participate in this event, and to extend a special hello to all of you from EAIE's President Sabine Pendel, who would also like to have participated in this discussion today if timing had allowed for that. Sabine is planning to be at the CAEI conference in Bogota in October, and I know she'll be very interested in speaking with many of you about shared experiences and unique challenges we face in international education around the world. These are things that both the EAIE and CAEI are so very good at doing. I'm very excited to be a part of the conversation today for several reasons. The first is that I think that the topic that has been selected for the CAEI conference in 2019 is tremendously important and intriguing. Hubs of knowledge and innovation, synergies for development, is a theme that I'm guessing most of us feel is highly appropriate for our times. As we all know, we are operating in an age of intense social, political, and demographic changes. We face profound environmental developments, and we're also living in an era of unprecedented innovation dynamics. So hubs, for me, stand out as configurations that offer immense potential to help us address the challenges we face today. My perception of hubs is that they are concentrated focal points where all kinds of resources can be coordinated in uniquely powerful ways, and a range of vital synergies can be leveraged in creative arrangements. Ideally, these synergies serve to generate viable solutions and hopefully also exciting new questions that can serve to advance our collective ongoing ambition to, frankly speaking, sustain and enhance life on this planet in its most equitable, inclusive, just, and dignified forms. So as you can tell, I have many ambitions for hubs, but of course, they may also offer challenges and unintended consequences that we need to pay attention to. But this webinar is less about what I think and much more about what our featured speaker knows and thinks about this exciting topic, particularly from the perspective of knowledge hubs and their communities, international challenges and opportunities. And indeed, on this subject, our speaker has a great deal to share. Which brings me to the second reason for which I'm so delighted to be a part of this event, as it gives me the opportunity to reconnect with a close friend and colleague, Professor Hans de Wit. Luis has already given you an indication of Hans's extremely impressive background. He has an immensely long curriculum as a researcher, a professor, a high-level university administrator, an advisor to governments, international and national organizations, associations, and individual universities. He writes prolifically and can always be counted on to present exceedingly intelligent insights and thought-provoking pronouncements that get us thinking more deeply and critically about the topic at hand. Anyone who knows Hans also knows that he travels extensively, but in the context of this webinar, I think it's very important to note that Hans, although European, has a deep and abiding fondness for the Americas and has incredibly deep knowledge about this region of the world. I'm delighted to turn the microphone over now to Hans and ask him to take us forward with this conversation. Hans?
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Luis, for introducing me. You have set the bar very high for me. Buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenue ici. We're going, unfortunately, to have to speak in English, although I always say that it's unfortunate because English should not be the only language of communication, but it is in reality that most people are better in English, so I will obey to that, but with some reluctance. We're talking about the knowledge hubs and their communities, and what are the international challenges and opportunities. But I could also say what are the local and national challenges and opportunities for knowledge hubs, because increasingly, as I will address, international, regional, national, local are very much connected and should be very much more connected even than currently is the case. So that will be an important part of my message. So what I'm going to address is, what do we mean by knowledge hubs? And as you will see, sometimes they use education hubs, but there is a very clear reason why we should use the word knowledge instead of education for addressing the issue that we are treating today. Who are the key players? And how can they bridge the connection of local, national, global in particular? And that in a time, as we know, of increased nationalism, anti-immigration, anti-globalism, denial of sustainable development goals like climate change, etc. So what does that mean for knowledge hubs? How can they contribute to bring all those issues together? What are some of the main challenges and trends that we see in the development of knowledge hubs and the role of the stakeholders in that context? And what are some challenging examples and best practices? And I hope in particular we can do that also in further discussion. I first summarize some of previous slides that have been developed by Janet Velers, who I know is in the audience and who's a great friend and colleague and also very much working in this issue, and Louise for a previous webinar based on the work that my dear friend and colleague Jay Knight has been doing, writing not only in a book about educational hubs, but also for International Higher Education, the Journal of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. And what she says about what is an education hub, it is being used by countries, cities or regions, and already there we see different actors in the whole play that are trying to build a critical mass of local and foreign actors, including students, education institutions, companies, knowledge industries, science and technology centers. So a lot of different stakeholders together again, which through interaction and in some cases co-location engage in education, training, knowledge production and innovative initiatives. So a very broad definition, a very broad range of stakeholders, a very broad range of activities that are describing what is an education hub. So we have to go a little bit more in detail about that. But before that, education hubs or knowledge hubs have not emerged just like that. They are part of an emerging trend that we have seen over many decades in the development of internationalization in the context of what Jay Knight has defined as internationalization abroad. The two components of internationalization, abroad and at home, with the accents on the abroad side much more on the mobility dimension, where at the home side much more on the local dimension. And of course, that's one of the big challenges in the two components, that they have to be interconnected, but the origin still is very strongly based, as he describes, on the abroad side, and it started with the mobility of people, particularly the student mobility. And student mobility, in particular the degree or diploma mobility, that is still the dominant form of internationalization abroad. Students going for a full degree in studying in another country. That was already for decades, even if we can say centuries, the case as the main focus of mobility and internationalization abroad. Then gradually in the past century, and in particular in the past 30 years, we see also the mobility of programs and providers, the development of branch campuses, franchise operation, articulation programs, joint and dual degree programs, and of course the whole emergence of online and virtual education. That was basically a fundamental shift in the sense that not only students have to move, but also you can move the programs and the activities to the students and to the external community. So that was a trend, and still a trend, like also mobility of students is still an important factor in internationalization, but that has been developed and is still in the evolution with a lot of trial and error, because there are many branch campuses that not have been successful. There are many franchise operations of dubious quality. There are many online different modes of delivery, etc. happening. And what we see is the education or knowledge hubs have become the next stage of this whole internationalization abroad. where there is a much more comprehensive way of looking at different types, and I come back to that, of activities brought together and different stakeholders brought together, instead of a more fragmented, isolated activity of a student being mobile or a program being mobile, much more of a coherent policy. And the question what I will address at the end is, what will be the next stage? And is there a next stage, and what will be the essence of the next stage? But that will come back at the end. EAIE describes three types of hubs: student hubs, talent or skilled workforce hubs, and knowledge and innovation hub. The student hub was very much more focused that you create as a country invites a foreign institution to set up a campus or a program or a franchise operation or a collection of those kind of activities where students were trained by the foreign providers, mostly at the undergraduate level. So it was basically to create a way of introducing new opportunities in the process of massification of higher education, mainly in developing and emerging countries. The second type, which later was much more focused and attention, was the talent or skilled workforce hub. That was where foreign providers would be brought in to help to create a much more skilled workforce. So more focus also on graduate education, professional developments, training of staff, training of adult education, a much more higher level of stage of educational hub than the student hub was. And the third one, and that's the most innovative and latest one, is much more focused on knowledge and innovation, where the accent is much more on research and innovation and development, and bringing in not only institutions of higher education, but also research institutes, private companies, and bringing all those different stakeholders together in working on innovation and change and development of the country. So the accent is different in different types of hubs, but all three we have seen developing, and all three exist, but the latest trend is much more focused on knowledge and innovation. So that's why we call it also knowledge hubs and not so much education hubs. And as you see as the main characteristics, there are, the location is very important, and I come back to that. The different types of locations that you have. The most accent recently is, as I will discuss, are big cities, but you have also taken, for instance, Silicon Valley as a kind of location, which is not in a big city. You have smaller cities doing it. So all kind of ways how your location plays a role. Engagement of both local, regional, national, international stakeholders. Looking at the impact, so what do we want to accomplish with educational of knowledge hubs? I would add to that rationales. Why are we doing this? Which also can be quite different, and can also be the accent in the three types of hubs. But what are the social, economic, and education indicators that create the impact? And it's very important that the different stakeholders have a clear, common understanding of those kind of what the impact of their investment in knowledge hubs is. All kind of different activities. Research, teaching, undergraduate, graduate, patent development, new products development, all kind of activities taking place in this area, and we have to be clear about the relationship between those four characteristics, and including also the rationales as the basis for that when we talk about knowledge hubs. So what is the purpose of an education or knowledge hub, and has been described as well previously by Janet and Louise, is to coordinate actions to generate a networking space to promote innovation, entrepreneurship, and transfer knowledge and technology from higher education institutions. So you see already the universities or institutions of higher education play an active role in bringing the different stakeholders together to generate innovation, to generate entrepreneurship, and to transfer knowledge and technology. that is basically what we are talking about. That is the context where we start from, but we have to address several critical elements in the notion of knowledge hubs. First of all, we see, and that's a trend in neoliberal societies that we live in, that economic rationales are very much driving still the agenda of knowledge hubs development. Less so academic, social, and cultural motivations. And I come back to that later, why it is important to add those dimensions to the rationales and the outcomes and the impact of knowledge hubs. Reputation and branding are other important drivers. To be key knowledge competitors in rankings and branding as cities and as universities and as research centers are also very much driving the agenda in addition to the more economic rationales. Another critical element in my view is it is not always clear what the focus of knowledge hubs is. Is it more focused on students, talents, or knowledge innovation? Or is it a combination of two or three? And many knowledge hubs are not clear that because they don't have their rationale why they are doing that very clear. And a successful knowledge hub has a comprehensive approach in which they focus not only on students, but also talents and all knowledge and innovation. So making the combination of the different objectives, initiatives, much more clear. But we also see there's not always a clear relationship between local, national, regional, and global objectives and stakeholders. Like in partnerships of universities, there's a potential risk of hierarchy and inequity between the partners, in particular in the context of North-South relations. So if you would have development of knowledge hubs in Latin America or certain parts of Africa, there is a kind of risk that there's a power hierarchy relationship where the external stakeholders internationally dominate the rationales, but also the activities and the products and the outcomes, the impact of knowledge hubs. So we have to be clear about the different roles and objectives of the stakeholders, and don't forget, and that's in essence, what is the impact for the local institutions, the local companies, the local community in this whole development of knowledge hubs. And so it is important that there is a relationship and cooperation between local stakeholders in the development and execution of knowledge hubs, and that's not always very clearly defined. And for me, a successful knowledge hub is where it is directed in cooperation between the local stakeholders and bring in the external international stakeholders more as a kind of support and addition to the process where the local stakeholders have a clear common rationale why they are going to do this and what they are going to do and what the outcome of the whole process is. And in my view, that's not always very clearly defined. What we see is an increasing importance of cities in this whole process, where in the past knowledge hubs could exist like in Silicon Valley, not related to big cities, but outside and more based on initiatives by local institutions or by local companies. We see now a transfer of the importance of cities as being leading the innovation and becoming the centers of knowledge hubs. Big cities like New York are global knowledge hubs development. We see that elsewhere in the world. We have seen that cities like New York have been inviting institutions and companies to work together to create whole new knowledge hub centers. Amsterdam, the Netherlands, another example of that. Dublin is mentioned. So there are some key players, and you see that also at the regional and national level, for instance in Latin America, in Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and in Bogota, as examples where cities try to become really knowledge hubs working together between the different stakeholders. But it is not necessarily the case that every knowledge hub has to be of world class, has to be a global player and has to be in the big cities, the big capitals and big cities of the world. I give the example of the Netherlands, where you see that besides Amsterdam, that wants to be a world-class global knowledge hub, there are other regional examples which have been very successful. For instance, in the technology area, Eindhoven, where Philips company is a very important player, they focus on the needs of technology hub. In Wageningen, where the agrarian university is, they focus on food as a kind of hub. And in Nijmegen, which has a University of Applied Science with the health sector and many health companies, they focus much more on the medical hub and the health sciences as a very important part. So niche development might be also a way how you can create a knowledge hub with a clear rationale and a clear focus. It doesn't have to be everything. It doesn't have to be a big picture. You can also see where my city, my institutions in my city can play a role in developing a niche, important knowledge hub for the local community, but also in connection to the national, regional, and the global environment. So some important lessons that we have to address. Knowledge hubs need to have a clear context and rationale, based on an external and internal assessment of strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. Here comes the niche again. Why are we doing this, and what do we have that makes us an opportunity to be successful? And what are our weaknesses where we have to bring in other stakeholders to make it a success? That's very important. Knowledge hubs have to avoid being too broad and need to focus on their strengths. So be clear about why we have to do that, and then create a comprehensive approach based on clear strengths and clear focus on them. Knowledge hubs should not only look at the competitive global opportunities, but should also build on local and national needs and opportunities. So start why is it important for our local context that we want to do this? What can we benefit from it, and how then can we use the international connection out of that? In many cases it is the opposite way that it is developed. It is that international stakeholders see an opportunity and have then asked the local environment to give them the infrastructure and the capacity to do that. It should be really based on an initiative coming from bottom up in the local context. Another important point is social and cultural dimension initiatives as part of knowledge hubs should receive much more attention. We not focus only on patents and on new products, etc., but we also have to pay attention to soft skills development. How can we develop those soft skills among the talents and among the students and as part of the whole enterprise? How can we contribute to sustainable development goals? So what can the knowledge hub contribute to climate change and to address that? How can we deal with equity and diversity aspects in the knowledge hub? So to avoid that the knowledge hub becomes isolated from the people in the local communities that have not access to the expertise, and that it becomes a very elitist type of operation, completely disaligned from what the local community needs. Knowledge hubs need only to look at the competition, but also look at cooperation and complementary opportunities. So if you have a knowledge hub in Bogota, you might compete with Sao Paulo, but you might also think maybe we can join forces and look together how we can benefit from each other, how can we look at our complementary opportunities there. That's also far too little happening, and that's an important lesson that we have to keep in mind. In the current political climate, which is unfortunately very anti-international and very nationalist, we have to see how we can focus much less on the competitive and economic revenue aspects and much more looking at the local dimensions, more attention on social dimensions and needs, more on what does it mean for our local environment. Because only if you have that as a basis, you get the commitment and the support to say, well, from a local perspective, it's important to be connected to the rest of the world, not because of the fact that we have to be global by nature. That doesn't work. There's a stronger appeal, lessons to be learned from the nationalist developments in the world, that we have to pay much more attention to the local dimension of it. We have to focus much more on collaboration than on competition. We have to include citizen development as a key factor in knowledge hubs, so that people become much more aware about the role that it means for the local community and for that. And higher education institutions in particular, in my view, have a key role in emphasizing and incorporating the social dimensions as part of knowledge hubs. They should not be focused exclusively also on the STEM fields and on innovation and technology, but they should also would bring in this kind of citizen development as a key factor in what knowledge hubs could be. So what does that mean in my view for the 4 stages which I referred to before in the development of knowledge hubs? In my view, knowledge hubs have to be seen much more related to the globalization of higher education and find out how you can create this kind of focus on how can we develop this soft skills, the citizen development as a part of it. Not focusing exclusively on neoliberal trends in higher education, more competition, more recruitments, more revenue, etc. But look at it in the definition of what we have been saying before of internationalization of higher education in the current context, to give it a much more normative direction, that it has to be enhancing the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. That's what we say about internationalization, and by that we should also say that is the role of knowledge hubs, to make a meaningful contribution to society, to include all students and staff of an institution in the process of knowledge hub development, and also to focus on quality improvement and not only on the revenue side or on the innovation side in a very isolated way. That, in my view, would be an important next step, and would be, in my view, also an important dimension of the discussion that we need to have in the conference in Bogota on knowledge hub development and on innovation and the role of cities in that whole context. How can we bring much more quality to that whole debate? I hope by that to have given you a platform for discussion, and for I give the floor back to Laura to start that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hans. You know, in a relatively brief number of minutes, you've covered an enormous amount of ground in relation to this topic, really orienting us into some fundamental definitions, providing some key examples at local, national, regional, international level, and then also leaving us with a very important call to action, which is to think about how and in what ways should the next iteration of hubs develop, and in what ways can we think about that happening in such a fashion that it makes a positive difference in the world, and that it really attends to all the stakeholders that can and are implicated in the work of hubs. So thank you so much for that. We have a series of inputs so far, some ideas that I think would be interesting for us to explore a little bit. I'd like to bring up a question for you about how you see different fields or different disciplines fitting into the hub dynamic. Are we talking here almost exclusively about the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or is there space for other fields to be involved in, and how might you see that kind of dynamic?
Well, thank you. Yes, I think it's very clear from my perspective and my direction that I think we should not exclusively focus on STEM fields. We should focus on much more an interdisciplinary approach to knowledge, in which we look not only to the technical side and bring in much more the social and humanistic dimension of the university, citizenship development, soft skill development. And only if you bring in that interdisciplinary approach, you really can also address the global issues of the Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of objective of knowledge hubs. Only by being critical, analyzing what is the context of innovation, what is the impact of innovation, what are the potential risks to that. We don't see that so much, so a very strong role should, in my view, be from humanities and social sciences in the way we address those issues in knowledge hubs.
Hmm. Another question that springs to mind is the focus that you placed on cities, and cities really are kind of ground zero for the vast majority of these knowledge and innovation hubs. At the same time, we know from a lot of experience around the world that there are very serious urban-rural divides in all countries, it seems, where rural communities are really being cut out of important social networks, libraries, museums, other skills and services networks like hospitals and schools and that kind of thing. Do you see a problem with the matter that hubs are so, it seems, organically drawn to city environments? And is there something that we can be thinking about in terms of not further damaging the situation in rural communities, but rather seeing hubs as potentially a bridge to those wider communities?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and there is indeed an inherent danger in the development of knowledge hubs very exclusively focused on the big cities that the divide is going to develop. That's also why I think it's important to look at different types of hubs and different types of focus, and not try to do everything in one place, but look at what are different opportunities. The examples, I mean, if you look at Colombia, not everything has to happen in Bogota. There are fascinating things happening in Medellin. There are fascinating things happening in Cali and maybe in Barranquilla. Chile, examples like Concepcion and Valparaiso, in addition to Santiago, even probably more than Santiago, are also ways how you can diversify. I mean, that's why I gave the example of the Netherlands, where there are several things happening. Looking at what is a need in those smaller cities, which are basically having a much more central role in the rural community they are facilitating, and how they can bring in the issues and the questions and the concerns of those rural communities in developing smaller but much more effective knowledge hubs than only focusing exclusively on the big cities. I know it's easier said than done, and there is a trend in general always to focus on the bigger cities as being the key players, because there is the power, the political power, there's the economic power, there's the financial power, there's also the knowledge power of the big universities in many cases. So there is a trend to focus everywhere on the big cities, and that's difficult to avoid because it also brings together the basis for a successful lab. But there are good examples on how you can do on a smaller scale also this kind of innovative developments in a much more rural setting. And could be done.
I also wonder if you have some thoughts on the question of scale. So we have an example, a really interesting example out of the Netherlands, a smaller country geographically with potentially less difficulty kind of communicating across distances and figuring out what a network of hubs at a national level might look like, versus something like what we might be seeing in Africa with centers of excellence across that vast continent, which offers a lot of exciting opportunities, but also I think some challenges as well. Do you have any thoughts about that question of scale and the challenges and possibilities that come with that?
Yeah, and of course it is much more complex in the example what you gave, Africa, where there's not so much of a kind of strong knowledge centers of excellence in the whole continent, so it makes it much more difficult to do than if you, for instance, talk about Canada, where you have Montreal, where you have Toronto, where you have Vancouver, and they can, as centers of excellence, basically develop much more their own knowledge hubs than that they have to look at one place to do that. And you see that in the United States, and you see that in other regions as well. But I think that it is for that reason important, what I said in answer to your previous question, you have to not look at one concentration, but develop smaller concentrations in other parts of the country or the region. And the second point what I made was collaboration. Don't see a knowledge hub as something exclusively where you don't work together with others, but make advantage of the opportunity to work together. With modern communication, with modern technology, it's much more easier than in the past, that you can see, okay, we cannot do this. We know that in Sao Paulo they do it much better than in Bogota on that area, so let's ask them to collaborate with us on that specific area, etc. So collaboration should be a much more important element of knowledge hubs than only focusing on the competitive part. And if you do that, then it's more easier or less difficult, let me put it more modestly, to create an opportunity for a fast, larger country or region to be effective in creating a really strong knowledge environment. That's what you see also an example of what is happening now in Europe, the so-called Macron initiative, where there has been, and actually we are currently writing with two of my students an article on that for probably for University World News. We have seen in the past that Europe wanted to create a European university. One university that could compete with MIT in technology, etc. It didn't work because national interest, local interest, where to put it was a big disaster, and nothing came out of it, or only very small enterprises like the European Institute in Florence. Now they have taken a different role, and they have said, well, let's bring universities together as a knowledge group, a network of European universities on different focuses. There are proposals that are much more on working together in the health sciences or in the engineering or in the life sciences. There are proposals where they are focused much more on regional cooperation, Strasbourg and Basel and Freiburg, etc., Karlsruhe together. They are focusing much more on creating a kind of joint knowledge and student field, like a consortium of universities from Ghent, Groningen, Uppsala, etc. So also there you see that now they have learned a lesson. Collaboration, networking development might be a much more effective way of how to reach the objectives that in the past you wanted to do, but one focus on one location only. So maybe that's a lesson also that we can learn. Create several specific knowledge hubs, but work together as one community.
Mm-hmm. As hubs are conceptualized and kind of come together in reality, you have these two notions that you've been talking about. You have competition and you have cooperation. One of the issues that someone from our audience has brought up is also this notion of leadership. When you have a consortium that's come together to build a hub, there are different kinds of sectors that need to be involved and areas of expertise. But in practice, might there also be a need for within that there be a leader, that kind of pulls everything forward and plays a particular role? I think a lot of people think that higher education institutions are kind of specially positioned to do that because they have their fingers in so many different areas and are sort of cross-cutting in a lot of different ways. But I wonder what you think about that idea of how to decide who leads, who pushes the thing forward.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most complex and difficult parts of successful knowledge hubs is who takes the lead and who can take the lead, and in what way you have to take the lead. In many cases it is city governments, but then you enter in all kind of political and bureaucratic arrangements, which makes it very ineffective. If it is the industry, then you get a different kind of focus where their own interests are much more important than the interest of innovation and knowledge development and the educational side. If it is a higher education institution, there's also a risk that it is not seen by the private sector and by the government as being the real leader. So I think what we have to try to avoid to make one of the stakeholders the real leader, but that it has to be a much more a collective enterprise in which they define a leader that is really bringing all the stakeholders together and drives the agenda and motivates the agenda together. So sometimes an external kind of person or entity that has a kind of enough acceptance by the different stakeholders to drive the process can be more effective than giving the lead to one of the stakeholders. Because if you take one of the stakeholders the lead, immediately the other ones to say, well, it's their interest, it's not our interest, so why should we collaborate? So you have to think very carefully about how you manage the process, how you bring the stakeholders together, and at the same time how you don't fall in the trap of regulations and political debates, etc. That's not an easy answer to that question, but it is very important to look into, can we create a common mission, a common vision, and based on that appoints some entity or some person to make the lead for that common vision and common mission to make it happen.
We also have some input from the audience around the question of scaling up. And I wonder if you're a believer in hubs really starting off with a modest beginning and growing from that, or is there some sort of competitive advantage to really thinking big from the beginning and really establishing oneself from the beginning as this is the hub and not growing in that same kind of way from a seed?
Yeah, I don't think you can say it in absolute terms, one is better than the other. It all depends again on context. It also depends on why are you doing this. If you have a clear, broad vision together, and also the means to make it happen, where everybody's inspired to say, well, we want to do something really that makes a difference, then go for it. But in many cases, the risk is that the vision is very big and the mission and the reality are much less big. And then you get tensions. Then people are dropping out because they're disappointed that the big vision has not been accomplished, etc. In those cases where you don't have the means to be big and visionary to make it happen, start small, smart focused on where is our niche, where is our strength, what are our exact opportunities, what possibilities do we have. And in many cases, then I would say start small and develop that and make a plan for 5 or 10 years to develop the process and gradually enhance it. So it very much depends on context, what is the wisest approach to do this. It also depends on how many, and I then specifically talk about the higher education side, because that's the audience we are talking mainly to now. How strong is your institution? How comprehensive is your institution? How what can you bring in that process? If you are a top national research institution and you have sciences and engineering, you have the medical field, you have good social science and humanities, and you really have the recognition also by the private sector and the government as being a key player, then you can maybe better be big. Or if you have a conglomerate of institutions that work together, Unfortunately, that is not always the case. Also, universities compete much more with other than they work together. But if you would have a good, nice conglomerate of strong institutions, not only necessarily all have to be research universities. You could have good teaching institutions, professional schools, University of Applied Sciences as part of that process. In many cases, in Europe, it is a combination of research universities and University of Applied Sciences that are active. But look into how strong are you together in your ambition to make it happen.
And to a very specific case in point, we've had a couple of people raise the question about the city of Barcelona. And if we're talking about the evolution of hubs around the world, can we consider Barcelona to be at the forefront in some sort of new evolution or new phase that some other cities might not yet be in?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that Barcelona is a very clear example of a city with has a very strong set of high quality institutions of higher education, has a strong regional and local leadership to make it happen, even in the current political context of Catalonia. It is a very strong, we want to position Barcelona as a really global player in knowledge. It has a strong private sector, so in that sense it has all the opportunities to make themselves a global player. But you cannot simply copy Barcelona to other cases, because you need to have the similar set of environment to make that happen, and that's not always the case. In many cases, even not the case. So that's why I say you have to always to start from why our local context creates opportunities, and how can we do that? What our strengths are, what our needs are, and build on that how you develop it. And then you might come to different conclusions than Barcelona, but you still can be very successful in a different way than Barcelona is. So, like everything, we cannot copy Harvard to the University, National University of Columbia, or to the UNAM. We cannot Harvard copy it even to Boston College. It's all contexts are different, and so simply copying Barcelona to the Latin American context is not possible, but you can still learn from their strengths and their weaknesses for your local context. So always look at benchmarking, but don't use a benchmark that is over the top, because then it doesn't work. You have to look in the same level playing field. So look much more at what you can learn from in Bogota, from Lima, or something like that. But don't try always to copy Europe or United States or Canada, because the context and the conditions and the historical development are completely different.
And you know, over-the-top success also comes with its price. You know, you have a city like Barcelona that's actively trying to think through how much tourism is too much tourism. You have Silicon Valley with housing prices that are completely out of reach of, you know, very many people who need and want to live there. And the availability of basic services and things like that can be a challenge in those contexts. So maybe as a last question for you, thinking about in the current context, how we assess the success of a hub, I think becomes really important. And you've talked about economic motivations, social and cultural impacts and things like that. How do we factor all those things into some sort of rational assessment of whether or not a hub is doing a good job or not?
Well, yeah, assessment is always related to your rationale. So why did you want to do this, and what you define as a result of that, of the outcome of your initiative. And again, you cannot generalize that. So you have always to look at, well, this is why we did it, this is what we wanted to get out of it, and we have on a regular basis as stakeholders sit together, did we accomplish that? Are we on the right track? Are all the different stakeholders getting out of it what they need to have, not only one stakeholder? what is the impact on the local community? Did we care about the development of the local community? Did we look into the issue of the impact on the development and on climate change in the local factors? So don't look always at the global side in that. That's, in my view, very essential. So measuring success is a joint effort of looking into what were your original objectives and goals, and are you moving into the right direction? And don't be afraid to redirect if necessary, because context might change. And by that, you have to say, well, okay, when we planned this, maybe we were too optimistic, or we didn't take into account these contexts, and we have to see how can we redirect that, and what can we learn from others in that process. But measuring success is a joint effort. That's the most important thing in the whole process.
Well, Hans, our original goal and objective was to stimulate a conversation about knowledge hubs and their communities. And I know I've certainly enjoyed having this conversation with you, and virtually with our audience pulling in their ideas and questions for you. So thank you very much, and I'd like to turn this back over to Luis at this point.
Thank you so much to both of you. It has been a very enlightening conversation, and it has opened up the conversation, like we said before, in many directions, and has covered a very broad number of concerns and matters surrounding this shared exciting idea about knowledge hubs, and how do we come around them, and what do we do as higher education institutions, and how do we build and capitalize from our knowledge and innovation. So most sincerely, thank you on behalf of the Conference of the Americas for taking the time to do this and share your knowledge and your time and your experience, and helping get the ball rolling in terms of what we need to think about as we go forward. Because this is just, it's not only a trend, is a way to organize ourselves as institutions, as communities, as cities, as regions, and how best to impact all of the elements of our communities in the better way possible. And so for that, we're very grateful on this side. And I also want to thank everyone for the enthusiastic participation in today's session. It's been a true pleasure. The session will be recorded and will be made available to anyone to consult from now until the day of the conference. And so hopefully you can come back and revisit and share it with friends and share it with colleagues and revisit the conversations and the exchanges that were happening today, so that that can help direct whatever ideas you may have about how to approach the conference in Bogota, and then finally meet together and sort of exchange this as we go forward. This is we look forward to this opportunity. So I would like to sign off on a couple of reminders as we're doing this. Registration to CAEI Colombia 2019 is now officially open. So we invite you to visit our website at your earliest convenience, so you can process your registration and take advantage of the early bird rates that are currently available. While you're on the website, why don't you take the time to go visit the call for proposals, and let it be known the system is open. We're now accepting submissions, and we're sure looking forward to yours. The deadline is now set for May the 10th. Make a note of that. So there's enough time to pick a topic and submit an engaging proposal that aligns with this year's main themes: hubs of knowledge and innovation, synergies for development. And in that, there's a bunch of elements that Hans and Laura have talked about today that are just conveniently encompassed. So there's space for everyone if we start thinking from that side. Finally, don't forget to mark your calendars, please. Our second webinar is scheduled for May the 7th. In it, Professors Kiki Caruson and Karen Holbrook from the University of Southern Florida will share with the audience the different examples of how higher education institutions are setting up innovative international collaboration networks to promote development in their communities through research, innovation, and transferability. This session is organized in collaboration with the Institute for International Education, so we look forward to all of you and to carry on with our discussions. Con eso termino el día de hoy. Quiero darle las gracias sinceramente una vez más a Laura y a Hans por su tiempo, conocimiento, experiencia y la oportunidad de intercambiar con todos nosotros. La sesión se queda disponible. Ha sido un gusto. Estaremos viéndonos pronto y ojalá nos veamos todos en Bogotá. Hasta la próxima.
Hasta